The next piece that we're going to do, so the next sample that we're going to do is we're going to pipe, so use a piping foot or a zipper foot to pipe around a corner. So I've cut out 2 pieces. I'm going to neaten them off together, and they are approximately, so that's 7.5 inches square, so it's slightly off. So I've got 2 pieces. I'm going to give them a press, and then I'm going to put 1 piece to one side and concentrate on this piece. So to start off with, I'm going to measure around to see how much bias binding that I need to make my piping. So if you've already got some pre-made piping, you can use that. But if you haven't, if you get yourself some bias binding and some card, and I'll show you the next little bit to work out. So I'm just measuring with my bias binding, quite roughly. I want some extra bias binding, just in case. You don't have to do a full square either. You can just do one section. So the unit requirement is that you use a piping or zipper foot to pipe around a corner. So a corner, but I'm going to show you the full piece. So imagine you would be piping around to make a cushion, piping around a cushion cover. So I've got my piping card, and I'm just going to measure that against my bias binding, but I'm just going to leave myself a little bit extra so that I don't lose any of the card in the bias tape. So give that a cut there. So now the next step, so I'm just going to move the card and the calico out of the way, and I'm going to open up my bias binding and run the iron down, because we put the piping card in the middle of the iron, in the middle of the bias tape. It's done like this. Oh, try not to melt it with your iron, like I've just done. So turn that down a little bit. So I'm just, might be able to iron that out, we'll see. No, just make it more of a mess. So again, I'm going to open up my bias binding. This time I'm just going to cover it over so it doesn't get burnt. And the aim is to iron it flat. It's better. So because I'm going all the way round, what I'm going to do is join my bias binding together. So I'm going to join it on the cross. So I'm going to put my 2 corners end pieces together with a little bit of an overlap at the top, and I'm going to stitch diagonally across. So have your material, have your bias binding in front of you if you're trying to work it out, because I often sew it the wrong way. So put your pin in. You want to be sewing from corner to corner, and if you're unsure which way that you need to sew, put your pin in the direction that you think you're going to sew, and then just open it out. And if it runs smoothly through, then you've got the right way. If it doesn't, unpin and try again. So I'm just putting the pin in the opposite direction to keep it together while I stitch it in place. So I'm just gonna run a stitch through the bias. I've got my zipper foot on already. So you do need a zipper foot or a piping foot for this. So a piping foot has got a groove underneath, so a single groove, which wraps around your piping in the same way that you can push the piping right up to the foot to stitch it together. So stitch that in. Oh, still on zigzag, don't do that. So that's stitched there. So I'm just going to press again using the cover so I don't burn it. I'm just going to press that seam open. And then I'm going to trim the excess off. So that's why I gave myself a little bit extra to play with so that I could join it onto the cross. That's my little zigzag mistake there. Right, so that's that done. So now I'm going to bring my piping cord back in. And the piping cord goes inside, so on the wrong side, and then the right side is wrapped around. So I'm going to pop it in, because I'm obviously got a full circle, I'm going to pop it in and I'm going to start here, even though I'm not starting right at the top of the card, because I'm going to ravel it and encase it. So I am using pink card. You're best off when you pink cotton thread. So you're best off when you're doing your piping is to make sure that you are using the same colour thread. If not, you can get pops of colour coming through. But I'm using a contrasting thread anyway, so you guys can see. So what I've done is I've got my piping here, so you can see the card there, and I've pushed it right up to the edge of the foot, and then my needle is going to go in really close to the piping card. Now I'm going to use just a normal stitch, so I'm on just after 2 stitch length, and I'm going to go for it. So all the time I'm just pushing the card, the piping towards the edge of the foot. Just angle that bit better for you. There you go. So I'm pulling it on a slight diagonal so it runs in tighter, and all the time I'm just rubbing it between my fingers to make sure that the piping is sat in the middle of the bias binding. And the reason why you use bias binding for piping is that it's because it's cut on the cross, it goes around corners really well. Although the sharp corners that I'm going to show you are slightly different and you need to snip into it. So you can use cotton binding, bias binding, you can use satin bias binding, but what you'll find with the satin bias binding is that it is slippier to work with. So if you want to pin your cord and your piping as you're sewing it, then you can do, that's fine. So I'm coming up towards the end, and what I want is for my piping to just overlap each other. So I'm just going to trim that down slightly and keep that in there. So it just went slightly off where the fullness of the two pieces of piping were overlapping. But that should be all right because it's in, so you just slightly went off. But we're going to encase it in the calico anyway, so it should be okay. So now I'm bringing back my calico, and I just want one piece to start off with, and I'm going to start to pin it in place. So I'm going to pin it across the flat, and I'm putting the raw edge of the bias tape to the raw edge of my calico. And so then when it's stitched on and turned over, it should all be neatened and in place. So I'm going to pin the sides, and I also, when you stitch in bias tape on around corners, you do need to snip into it at some point, which is towards the corners. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the width from the edge, so from the edge of the seam allowance, so from the raw edge, I'm measuring from the raw edge of the calico up to the piping, which on here is 1 centimetre, and so that's on that side, and then I'm going to come round to the edge. I'm going to measure up 1 centimetre here, and I'm going to put myself in a pin. So my seam allowance is basically 1 centimetre. So I'm going to put a pin in there so that I know where to stop to then be able to treat my corner. So I'll do that on the other side as well. So moving around. So it should be the same measurement, which it is. So measuring up 1 centimetre, so that's where my finger is. So I know again, so I know where to stop stitching. So I'm going to use the zipper foot again because I'm still working my piping. And I'm going to start where my first pin is. And I'm going to run down still as close to the piping as you can. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to get to the pin and stop. Right, I've just put a back stitch in to take it out so that I can show you what we're doing. And the reason for stopping here is because when you try and put your piping in, what happens is you get like a ridge, so it doesn't sit flat like you want it to. So where I've stopped stitching, I'm going to take my scissors and cut right up to that point. So right up to that stitch line, to then allow, even though bias binding goes around corners, it doesn't go round a sharp corner with piping in very well. So just by cutting that, you've opened up. So you've got to make sure that you snip right up to the stitch line, else it won't lay flat and there's no point in doing it. And then it'll open up for you be able to then stitch the rest of the corners in. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin that down and finish that bit off and stitch again up until 1 centimetre away from the end. So did I say that satin bias binding is slippy? So slippy, the pins are not going in. So what I'm going to do, which is another option as well, so I can stitch it all around in one go, is chop into it already. I'm going to chop in where my pin is, just on my biased tape up to my stitch line to allow it to then open out and move round. So I've made my bias tape too long for my piece, so I'm just gonna chop it and join it in a different way. So you've seen a couple of options there on how to join. The the thing with bias binding and piping is that it does stretch. So I'll move that around, and I'm just gonna take it off in that direction. And bring the other side round in the same way. And so I'm just going to set this crossover up. Take out some of that fullness for it to overlap. So by doing that, it's just flattening out the area that we're going to sew. So just and now I can continue to sew all the way around it. Now everything's pinned and lined up. So I'm going to go back in where I last finished. And continue stitching. So needle in, rotate round and continue then to sew. Pushing up against your piping. To make sure everything's in place. So when you're at your corner, again, needle in, lift your foot pedal up and rotate round, which will then keep your needle in the right place. Put my foot down now. So then we're back to where we started. So that's all your corners on and in place. So I'm just going to snip the loose threads off. And so that stitch has attached your piping around the corner, and the next piece that I'm gonna put in is to neaten it off also. So I'm gonna take the other piece of calico and put right sides together and pin in place the corners so nothing moves. Well, you can pin it anywhere, I'm just going for the corners. And then I'm going to stitch all the way around, and I'm going to leave a little section to pull everything through. So again, using your zipper foot, and you're still pushing as far up as you can to your piping. Just went slightly onto the piping cord there, so I'm just gonna bring it back. I can just unpick that piece. So that is the 4 corners. So I'm just going to press this piece back so that it'll be easier to stitch close. Do what I've done, turning it through. So with your inner construction techniques, you want your 4 corners cut in. And again, you don't have to do 4 corners, you only have to do 1 corner. So if you want to just get a square piece and cut in and do pipe and go around 1 corner, then that is fine. You will cover the unit requirements by doing that. Don't feel yet you've got to do 4 because I've done 4, because you don't. So if you want to get it done a little bit quicker, you can do. If you want to experiment a little bit more, then you can do, but you still want your 2 pieces together with your piping enclosed on the inside. So take all that away. And then I'm going to turn it through. So I'm going to bag it out. This is bagging out. Push them corners through. Just get your fingers in and push at the corners. And that's the piece that I just needed to unpick. And so that's your piping around corner. I'm just going to give it a little press to push them corners a little bit more. If you want to go back in and cut some of the bulk away between, you can do. And then you would just hand stitch that piece closed. And you'd have a nice sample piece there. So when you're stitched, that stitch then would be covered and it should all look very streamlined. So there you go. We've got piping around a corner